Hello, and welcome to another Credible Live broadcast, our last episode of the year. I am here with our CEO and Chairman, Brian Fitzpatrick, and this week we are very excited to be joined by Darwin Millard. Darwin is the Technical Director at Cannabis Safety and Quality, and he's here today to discuss very important information we need to know about safety in the cannabis industry. Thank you so much for being on the show today, Darwin. To get us started, could you tell us a bit more about your background and the work that you're currently doing?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Taylor and Brian, for having me on Credible Live today. I really appreciate it. I am an industry year, industry year. I'm an 18-year industry veteran, and I'm a mechanical engineer specializing in solvent and mechanical-based extraction methodologies for isolating terpenolic secondary metabolites, which is just a really fun way of saying that I know how to make oil well. And this has been my only career out of college. It has been in really legal cannabis. So I had the opportunity as a mechanical engineer to either design and build slurry pumps for the fracking industry or dive headfirst into the cannabis industry. And so I really kind of decided to follow my passion, and I wouldn't change anything for the world.
That's awesome. It's a great background, and I know that, I've seen you in many different venues of ASTM and around the industry. And, to us at Credible, everything's really about safety and quality standards in this industry. And I know you live, eat, and breathe that, especially with the group you're working with now at CSQ. One of the key things that I think has been a primary concern that, we talk about a lot, and we're going to dive deeper into this, is the need for national standards and people have to remember the reason for this is consumer safety, right? This is all about the end user at the end of the day. And without these uniform regulations, products can contain contaminants and inconsistency potency levels and harmful substances. And, the list goes on. And I remember when I first entered into this industry, people said, why are you getting into this industry? You've been in reg tech, fintech for all these years. And I said, because this is a growing industry, it's an important industry. And quite frankly, if it's not done safely and in a quality way, people are going to get sick, people are going to die. And we know in 2023, a California man died from a rare fungal infection that was believed, right, to be caused by contaminated medical marijuana that he used during chemotherapy. So we also know that when the California tested those 20 medical marijuana samples from different parts of the state, it revealed that most were tainted with dangerous bacteria and fungi. And we have this issue of because this is not federally legal, every single state has its idea of what testing standards should be, what is quality. So, this lays out a lot of opportunity to really work on what those national standards are. So, Darwin, you've been so involved in this. To me, you're like one of the key characters involved in this. And I've watched how hard you've worked with ASTM. I've seen so many of your posts and your podcasts and your writing. And so, talk to our audience a little bit about the history of safety and quality in cannabis and the CBD industry, because we know cannabis really is hemp, right? So it's hemp and it's marijuana. So how has the landscape evolved since you made that transition from that decision to be an engineer and stepping into this, this industry to focus your engineering skills in this industry particularly?
Yeah, well, I really appreciate the question because there has certainly been a lot of change, but at the same time, really not as much as maybe you'd hope or expect. Because some of these markets, right, are old, like 10 years old now, and in some cases, like California, even older than that, right? But what's kind of really interesting is that in a lot of cases, like Colorado, for instance, our market started out with these cannabinoid products being classified as neither a food nor a drug. And they kind of threw the consumer and really the entire marketplace into this like consume at your own risk type of mentality. Because you didn't have to necessarily follow food regulations or drug regulations. You could decide not to do either of those. It really wasn't well defined. There was kind of really that Wild West mentality. But we've seen as more states come online, especially as we've been moving East Coast, right? We've been begun to see that safety and quality requirements are slowly starting to pop up, which is great. Having been a part of the team that actually created the very first CBD dietary supplement to be sold legally in the United States before the Farm Bill, right as Weeds One actually aired on CNN. We were like the very first product back in the day with the Dixie Botanicals product line to have federally legal CBD from hemp available. So, kind of sparking that marketplace and being instrumental in it, it almost feels like I am almost responsible for the safety and quality of this space. And kind of are seeing our trend, a positive trend towards more regulations, but we still see kind of a pushback from some of these legacy markets towards against stricter regulations that maybe other industries, Brian, that you come from, where really, GMPs, quality management, that type of stuff, that's just seen as like the bare minimum normal stuff you do. And I'm hoping that what we'll see, coming on is that more people realizing that this isn't just something that is common sense. It also makes money.
Well, if you look at some of those other industries, we know that those industries are federally regulated, like food, is federally regulated, right? Through the Food and Drug Administration. But we've got this mishmash of craziness, in states, and some states, seem to get it right. Some states don't get it right. Some states don't know what they're doing. Talk a little bit about sort of what are those key things at a state level that we need to get together, and how they vary, and why, and what are those important things that really have to be standardized across every single state, even if we don't have federal legalization. Because to me, I think there's no reason why we can't adopt a standard, even if it's not federally legal. So what are those things that we have to focus on?
Yeah, so like as you were mentioning, right, the safety and quality standards from state to state really, they span the entire gambit. You've got some states that really only require you to have label content and standard operating procedures in place, whereas you have states like Florida and New York that they require full CGMP certification and HACCP programs to be in place. And then of course you've got strange markets like Maryland, for instance, that only requires GMPs if you're an edibles manufacturer making an edible with more than 25 milligrams per serving. So it's kind of like this mishmash, like you were saying, of different requirements, when really we kind of already know, like you already said, that if it's a food, there are established regulations for that on the federal level, 21 CFR 117, for instance, that is those good manufacturing practices for food. Like, why didn't we just implement those for cannabinoid products, right? And maybe classify them as novel foods. So it's kind of an interesting thing. As our markets are maturing, we're starting to see regulators relook and rethink at how they originally classified these products within their marketplaces. Colorado is another interesting example where if you are a hemp, if you're regulated under the hemp marketplace and you produce intoxicating cannabinoid products, then you're regulated under what they call safe harbor. And you're not allowed to sell your products within the state of Colorado. But you are allowed to sell your products outside of the state of Colorado, and are required to be GMP certified to 21 CFR 117 by an accredited third party. So that seems really interesting that in the same state that cannabinoid products from marijuana don't have to really do anything other than have a corrective actions and preventative actions program in place. That's kind of the bare minimum there. But at the same time, in the same state, you do intoxicating cannabinoids, same form factor, same product, but hemp, full GMP certification.
Right. Now, I know like this is an area that CSQ is doing some really neat work in, and that you've been working on. But when you go to some of these companies that are in these different states, you have to understand what each one of these states do. So you hit at the minimum criteria It's like, oh, so you almost had to like do a gap analysis, right? So you're hitting at the minimum criteria is what is that standard that operates that will cover all of these state requirements, which means you have to continue to follow what's going on in the states as well. So, I mean, that's got to be a challenge. How does your work vary based on which states, and how do you sort of, level that out across through the best quality standard out there?
I mean, that's a great question. And it's something that, multi-state operators have to wrestle with all the time. You're having to deal with different labeling requirements, for instance, right? That means you have fully different quality assurance and control programs for different markets, for different labeling content to make sure that you aren't accidentally labeling, say, your Massachusetts product with your Illinois labeling requirements. That's a big deal. It simply just makes it very complicated, right? For each state that has its own regulatory framework, someone who's trying to help a licensed operator comply with those requirements has to be aware of every single state's regulations. But for us, since we are actually a certification program developer, and we also we're a standards development organization, so we kind of create the things that are informed by those regulatory marketplaces. So as you mentioned, we basically have to mine those regulations for each state and each marketplace to ensure that our program conforms with those requirements. And for us, really, we're trying to establish a global standard, very similar to what ASTM is trying to do as well. So we're not looking at just like what is really the bar that needs to be set across all states. It's across international marketplaces.
I have this visual of this big funnel and it says CSQ on it, and in the top of the funnel goes all of this input, right, of not only the state requirements, but I know in CBD we got federal requirements and state requirements.
Yep.
And then we also have standards that, like ASTM, and then we've got GMP standards, we've got ISO standards. So I would imagine I could just vision all this stuff going into the top of this funnel, and all these amazing people and brains, working on this in the middle. So outside, what comes to the bottom of that is a enforceable and implementable standard. I mean, is that sort of I'm a visual guy. Is that sort of simplifying it too much, or is that sort of how it works?
That's a really great analogy and visual for sure. We have to constantly be assessing new information and using that to evolve and update our certification program so that it remains current and market relevant, as well as we want it to be flexible and actually usable by the industry. Because if it's seen as rigid and not really conformant to what an operator's actual business case is, then no one's going to use that quality management system, even if it is a great tool that can help them ensure that they're producing higher quality products and protecting consumer safety.
Now, it's interesting because I think it used to be sort of like cannabis was somewhat of a partisan issue, but it's become nonpartisan. When you look at the majority of Americans think this should be legal, and obviously, I don't think there's any Americans that are going to argue that it should be safe, right? So the bottom line is, to me, this is not a Democrat or Republican issue anymore. This is doing the right thing for the consumer, regardless of your political party. And we've seen good support from both sides of the aisle for this. And we've got a new administration coming in. So what are your thoughts about with the incoming Trump administration and RFK potentially as the HHS secretary? What do you sort of foresee or what needs to get done to really drive significant changes in cannabis so that we can see some of these things head in the right direction?
Brian, that's a really great question, and I don't know if I can actually answer it concisely. But what I would say would really help is not really a consolidation, but a coming together and a meeting of the minds of all these various trade associations. We seem to have many of them serving a burgeoning market still. Maybe we don't need so many different trade associations, right? Because that's diluting our voice on Capitol Hill, for instance, if we wanted to do a federal push. I think having a meeting of the minds, doing a Cannabis Trade Association, like a Continental Congress type of thing, and locking the door and not letting anybody out until we can come to some type of consensus around how the industry wants to see itself. And that would include cannabinoid products that are regulatorily classifiable as hemp, right? They are the same form factor products, have the ability to be, they don't have the burden of 280E, right? They have presumably a nationally legal marketplace to get to have access to, and having that same form factor product exist in a different marketplace under different restrictions, right, doesn't allow for really, it's not a sustainable marketplace, right? So we kind of have to come together towards that. I think that would be something we could do to help the Trump administration really maybe move the ball forward, is by seeing one cohesive voice. I think another smart strategy is doing state by state, doubling down on states' rights, and embracing each state level's program. So if there is a schedule change, right, on the federal level, all the existing state programs remain in some type of grandfathered fashion, or whatever makes sense.
Right. Well, we do know that Trump's stance on cannabis has evolved since his first term, and he's shown a lot of openness to reform. In fact, he even went so far as to say that he's going to support safer banking. He's going to support rescheduling. And, I think with Kennedy, Kennedy has even gone as far as saying that it should be descheduled, right? And he advocates for the federal legalization and the decriminalization, and using a cannabis tax revenue to fund rehabilitation centers. Now, I think we have to be careful with how much more tax we throw on the industry, because some of these states are choking these companies in a pretty significant way. Yeah. So please, no more tax, or at least make it reasonable. So I know that he's aiming to reduce barriers, and he said, for cannabis businesses, while addressing addiction issues. And to me, the most important thing that does is obviously 280E is just choking the industry. It's always been amazing to me that the federal government has its hands out for tax revenue. Everybody's saying, yeah, give me a piece of that, but yet you can't write off your expenses. That's just crazy to me. And the banking and industry access. I've talked a lot about what's needed to bring capital into this industry. And we do need, professional and more capital into the industry to make the kind of investments and support the kinds of businesses that are doing good things. And we certainly need more research in medical applications, so we can drive this sort of to a new level. And literally, he's got the power, if he is the HHS secretary, to accelerate an approval process and, sort of start driving some of these safety standards. And I know there's lots of challenges and considerations. It's Washington at the end of the day, but, but let's remain hopeful. It's, let's just remain hopeful at it. So, what I've seen is we were talking about before, is, we, in the manufacturing industry, there's all sorts of ISO standards, 9,001, 14,001, 45,001, 27,001, 50,001, and the list goes on, right? In the automotive industry, we've got very specific quality management requirements and systems in place. In aerospace, and I've done work in aerospace with configuration management systems. Let's put it this way, when I was sort of, I had a company that was working on the F-22 Joint Strike Fighter, and the configuration management around that, which means, tracking every single tiny little washer and button, where it goes, how it's placed, etc. If we ran the aerospace industry the way we're running the cannabis industry, airplanes would be dropping out of the sky, right? So, we need this kind of discipline. It's absolutely, critical. So, the problem that I've seen is, well, there's a lot of problems that we've seen. We've talked about some of them, but when we talk about cannabis quality, I've seen people's eyes roll to the back of their head. They're like, oh boy, because everybody seems to define or assess cannabis quality different. So, how do we really set the definition of quality? and how do you see the problems in getting that implemented?
So that's another great question too, especially in our space, right? So when we're talking about cannabis quality, what do we mean when we're saying the word cannabis? Because if we're talking about the flowering tops, right, then we could be looking at trichome density, we could be looking at the color of the flower, we could be looking at olfactory intensity, right? Like how intense was the smell or the taste of the material, both either before or after inhaling it. We could also be looking at the actual amount of bud material versus stick and stem that's in there, right? And actual like weight concentration that's there. So really, it's, as you already mentioned, a host of different metrics could be used for assessing what quality really is. And for myself as a lover of hash, it's, for me, it's a more of the measure of the complexity of that chemical profile that's there. Rather than really any aesthetic, right? Because they come in so many different consistencies, but really they're all kind of the same thing. But, really, are they? Because I think that's an area we're going to see a lot of focus in the next few years is really characterization of these cannabinoid containing substances, because we still really don't know. We have chromatographs, right, with incomplete peaks. We know that there's essentially unknowns coming along for the ride with our cannabinoid profile, our terpene profile. For instance, knowing how much fat content is in live rosin, for instance, that people are inhaling, I think is going to be a really critical quality attribute that we haven't even really started to think about, nor do we have the investigative analytical capabilities to even track down what fats and waxes and the lipids that potentially are there for us to know what their content should be kept at. So there's, I think that's, as you already mentioned, right? It comes down to what quality is, but it's product specification maybe more critically. That comes down to your form factor too, right? Is it flower? Is it an extract, an edible, or a topical product?
Well, what's interesting, I was just recently having a conversation with a group we're working with in Canada, and there was sort of a discussion about where do you start? Like, what are the most important factors and standards that are absolutely necessary to start with? And it led into this amazing debate with a lot of different brands and a lot of different opinions about where we should start. I mean, if you just break it down, because I mean, you've got all this knowledge in you, this amazing knowledge in your head, and you can get down to the science, the biology, the chemistry, you know, but where do we to get started, what should we be focusing on? And what are those few things that we should start with?
I mean, you're asking me the hard questions, Brian. So with respect to your question, do you mean, say, with implementing good manufacturing practices in your operation?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. When there was a belief, many said, well, we got to start with getting testing right. Right. If we don't get testing right and we don't create national standard on testing and what we're testing, how we're testing, what we're testing for, like, because that tells us a lot about what's going on, and we can then move on to the next level. So that's just an example that we chatted about up in Canada.
Yeah, so I mean, okay, so again, we're coming down to like what is a product, what types of products are you making, and the actual specifications, right? Because that's really what we're talking about. And I think maybe an example that makes this easier to conceptualize is label content requirements. You're going to make a declaration of the amount of cannabinoid content that's in that product. So essentially, that's a part of its quality is the defined amount of cannabinoid content that you're putting in that. So if you're able to have, say, an established specification for what that cannabinoid content is, and you're meeting that every time, then that potentially is a very high quality product. If we're talking about contaminants and the standard profile of contaminants, so your pesticides, heavy metals, microbial contaminants, residual solvents, if those are, applicable. Those are types of things where I think we have a little more agreement, right? From marketplace to marketplace, you want to definitely control those types of physical, chemical, and biological hazards, right? But to what level? And I think that's where we start running into those nuanced questions. Because if my product isn't classified as a food or a drug, then I don't have limits to immediately fall back to, right? Because for foods, we have defined limits for things as obscure as the amount of pieces of insect parts, right? That can be in our food. We have allowable limits for that. But if we don't classify a cannabinoid product as food, then what limits should we use? And that's kind of the debate I think we've seen, which has really just run into the issue of that with these varying different specifications from market to market, you can't define really what quality comes down to from, I guess, again, the consumer standpoint. Because what information are they really looking for when they're making a purchase?
And that's, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me, because it's got to come down to the product and how it's defined. You can't measure what you can't define or control, right? So, and the control aspect of this is, to me, is very important, which is why I advanced the technology into this industry through Credible, because we have a vision and mission that revolves around revolutionizing the way that businesses approach quality management and operational efficiency. But yet, if we don't have defined standards, it's hard to codify those things, right? So we recognize, and we also recognize that when I was looking at and doing research on tech in this space, that there's a separation of digital quality management systems and ERP solutions, right? They're like these two silos that are unnecessary, and they shouldn't happen, and because that hinders, to me, true operational excellence. So the core belief of Credible is that quality, compliance, and operational efficiency should not be treated as separate entities, but as integral, interconnected components of a business's DNA. So what we're focused on is delivering that innovative approach so we can codify all the things you guys are, working on and coming up with, right? So once you codify those standards, and once there's agreeable standards, we can codify them into practice through technology. So you don't just have Mary, Betty, and Billy, getting it right from their head, but you have the technology that's really driving the seamless integration of compliance requirements into your workflow process. Because I know we talk a lot about different things that Credible does, but that's really the vision and mission of what we're doing. And we got to rely on guys like you and organizations like CSQ to help drive these standards into industry so that they can be codified and digitized into practice so we can truly get it right. And that sort of leads me to, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about CSQ and that mission, because without doing the work that you're doing in companies, in organizations like CSQ, forget about the codification of it, because everybody's just sitting there confused, trying to pick apart different things and try to figure it out and get it right. So talk to me a little bit about CSQ.
Yeah, for sure. Well, first, I really want to appreciate what you had mentioned there, right? Because having full visibility over your process means you're having a more efficient business, which means you have lower costs of goods. And that's really what implementing a safety and quality management system like good manufacturing practices really does for your business. That's its core value. But I appreciate asking about CSQ. Cannabis Safety and Quality was launched in 2019. And we're the very first accredited CGMP certification program for the cannabis industries. And we're the only, at this time, accredited CGMP certification program that was created by and for the cannabis industry. So, and our program encompasses both marijuana and hemp aspects of the regulatory coding. And we've been certifying licensed operators across the United States since 2020 to CGMPs. And our mission is to develop the global standard for ensuring safety and quality management of the international cannabinoid-containing product supply chain, create legitimacy and stability in the marketplace through transparency and integrity, and to provide licensed operators with around the world with the tools that they need to have the greatest likelihood of success.
That's awesome. And how can people get in touch with you and CSQ? Because I think it's imperative that companies work with you with this organization to get these standards, to get the benefit of everything going into that funnel and it's coming out the other end, to get these things right. And then we can implement technology to help you codify it and reduce costs. So tell everybody how folks can get in touch with you.
Yeah, you can learn more by reaching out to me on LinkedIn. You can find me via my name, Darwin Millard. You can also find CSQ on LinkedIn via either CSQ or Cannabis Safety and Quality. And I encourage people to check out our website to learn more about the resources we have. You can download our full standard and audit requirements as well as our checklist directly from the website. Everything is there and free, available to the public at CSQ Certified. CSQ Certification.com.
And I just urge the industry to take advantage of this wonderful resource and check out. I always love Darwin's posts. I follow him frequently. He doesn't just say stuff to say stuff. He's when you put your post out there, Darwin, they're meaningful, they're impactful, and I want to thank you on behalf of the industry for the great work you've done, the work you are doing, and the work we know you'll continue to do in the future. So thanks for being on the show today. Great way to end 2024. So it's kind of like the cherry on top of the quality cake here. So Taylor, talk about what's up next in the new year.
Yeah. Thank you for an incredible last episode of the last episode of season 2. We're going to be back in the new year on Friday, January 10th at 3 p.m. Eastern for an episode with Aaron Pelly, where we will talk about cannabis law for businesses.
Awesome. Well, everybody, happy holidays. Don't drink too much eggnog. Stay safe and drive the quality of your organization so we can create a better industry together. Thanks for joining us.
Live long and process.